With that, I would like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging that where I am speaking from today is the land and territory of the Anishinaabe people. I wish to express my gratitude to my Mississauga neighbors. Our speakers today are in Montreal, Haudenosaunee territory, and Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. We say miigwech to thank them and other Aboriginal peoples for taking care of this land from time immemorial and for sharing this land with those of us who are newcomers. Out of that gratitude, we are all called to treat the land, its water, its plants, animals, stories, and its peoples with honor and respect. We are all treaty people. Thank you so much for joining us today. Health professionals, including public health providers, can be relatively uninformed of the international laws and legal frameworks that govern and impact the well-being of communities. And this is certainly true when it comes to the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. An understanding of the laws that encompass human rights values can assist us to deepen our responses to the health inequities being experienced by Indigenous people. So I think this is a timely webinar today. Some of you may have seen in the news recently that a group of people set out from Kitchener, Ontario on April the 23rd and walked 600 kilometers to Ottawa to bring attention to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They were calling on our federal government to fully adopt and implement the declaration in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples the framework for reconciliation to heal the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. The TRC challenged governments in their calls to actions 43 and 44, churches and other faith groups in the call to action number 48 to implement the UN Declaration. So the purpose of the webinar today is to introduce attendees to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People so that we are aware of its presence, its content, and its relevance to us and our communities. To do this, we are joined by our two presenters. Jennifer Preston is the Indigenous Rights Program Coordinator for Canadian Friends Service Committee, the Peace and Justice arm of the Quakers. She was actively involved in the intensive lobbying efforts to ensure the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in both Geneva and New York. Jennifer has worked closely with Indigenous peoples representatives and state representatives as well as human rights organizations in various regions of the world. Her work is now focusing on implementation of the Declaration. She is a co-author and contributor to Realizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Triumph, Hope, and Action. She serves on an advisory body to the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations with regards to implementation of the Declaration, and she represents the Canadian Friends Service Committee in the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also are very fortunate today to have Paul Joff. He is a member of the Quebec and Ontario bars. He represents the Grand Council of the Crees and collaborates with numerous Indigenous and human rights organizations in different regions of the world. He specializes in human rights and other issues relating to Indigenous peoples at the international and domestic level. His active involvement in international standard-setting processes includes those relating to the Declaration, this one today that we will be speaking about, but also the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the Organization of American States, and also the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention of 1989. Paul is also a co-editor and contributor to Realizing the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Triumph, Hope, and Action, and that was published in 2010 for those of you who want to go out and read it. Most recently, he is a contributor to the book Indivisible, Indigenous Human Rights, edited by Joyce Green. Paul is also an advisor to the National Chief's Office of the Assembly of First Nations, and he is also active with the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we're delighted to have both of you with us today, Jennifer and Paul, and with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to our guests.
Great. Hello. Thanks for that, Rosanna. And Paul and I are very pleased to be with you here today to do this webinar and to talk about the UN Declaration. And on the screen, I have the visual image of the booklet version of the Declaration, which the coalition that we're involved in has produced and has currently, we've printed and are in the process of distributing now. We're somewhere around 250,000 copies of the booklet. And I should say, if anybody who's watching the webinar is interested in getting bulk copies of the Declaration for distribution, just get in touch with me and I can make arrangements for that. We try to recover the cost of printing, which is about 50 cents a unit, but really our goal is to get them shared out there. So, and that's what the cover looks like there. So we wanted to start today with looking at we have a couple of quotes here that we're going to just share as a context builder for our presentation. And the first one actually comes from one of the preambular paragraphs of the Declaration itself. And we wanted to share this because we also wanted to always emphasize when we're talking about the UN Declaration, we're talking about inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. Inherent rights are the pre-existing rights, so it's never, states don't grant rights. These are pre-existing rights for Indigenous peoples, and that's what we're talking about in the UN Declaration. And also that the focus of this work is about the urgent need to respect and promote rights and the interconnected aspect of both cultural traditions, rights to lands, territories, and resources, and of course, all of those elements are interconnected to the health of Indigenous peoples. The second quote we wanted to start with, or the second slide here, the United Nations has developed a system-wide action plan for implementing the UN Declaration at the international level, and so we just wanted to pull this out as a reminder that in this work, we're looking at a human rights-based approach. And when we look at, in the discussion we're going to have today, we're looking at health through the lens of human rights and the corresponding obligations that come when we look at things through the human rights lens. And so that's what we'll be focusing on in our presentation. So the topics that we're covering really briefly is some background on the Declaration itself and the role of international human rights law in Canada. And particularly we'll focus in on the rights and obligations in the Declaration that relate to health to try and make it most relevant for this audience. And then we're going to also be looking at reconciliation and the TRC and how the TRC connects with the Declaration when we're looking at those obligations. And finally we'll end up with commitments that our current federal government has made with regard to both the UN Declaration and to the TRC. So to begin with the UN Declaration, and really we could spend at least an hour just talking about this, so I'm going to give you an extremely abbreviated version, but just to give some context, I think it's always important for people to understand the context of where the Declaration came from. And so it was developed in Geneva over a period of more than 2 decades, starting in the early 1980s, and that makes it the most discussed instrument in the history of the United Nations. And of course, the reason that the development took such a long time was that early on there was a commitment made by states that Indigenous peoples' representatives were also part of the consensus process of developing this instrument, which is another unique feature, that the rights holders, Indigenous peoples, were also developing the instrument, which is not usually the case at the UN. Usually UN processes are entirely state-driven. And so the fact that Indigenous peoples were having the same level of engagement and the same role in terms of achieving consensus further legitimizes this instrument, that it really, their work is what drove the development of it. So it was initially adopted in Geneva by the Human Rights Council in June of 2006, and then because of the way the UN is structured, it moved on to New York, to the General Assembly, and after some further negotiations, a slightly amended version was adopted in September of 2013, which means that we're coming up to the 10th anniversary this September of the Declaration. So the Declaration addresses both collective and individual rights, and this is another unique feature that is useful to know about this instrument, that we're not just talking about individual human rights, we're also talking about the collective human rights of Indigenous peoples. And it is the most comprehensive instrument to address Indigenous peoples. And as I said at the beginning, it's about inherent rights, so it's not about new rights. In the process of developing the Declaration, the existing human rights standards globally were taken and applied to the specific circumstances of Indigenous peoples globally. And there is an urgency in that, and the urgency has been recognized for decades. There's more than 370 million Indigenous people in more than 70 countries around the globe. And around the globe, Indigenous peoples are the most marginalized and discriminated against and dispossessed of their lands and territories. And so there was a real urgency to have an instrument to help to protect the human rights of Indigenous peoples. So this declaration has been, in the last 10 years, reaffirmed 3 times by consensus by the UN General Assembly, which further legitimizes it and increases its both legal and political weight. And this is a photo we just wanted to share of the day the Declaration was adopted. This is in the UN General Assembly Hall, and you see the green screens, and then it is the President of the General Assembly that's looking up at those green screens from the podium. And the way that it works in the UN General Assembly is when a resolution is being adopted, the President will read it out, and then states from their desks can press green, yellow, or red, depending on how they're voting. And literally up to the last minute, we did not know how that vote was going to go. And so when she read it out, we have a sea of green. And of course, there were 4 reds. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States voted against the Declaration, but all 4 of those states have reversed their positions. Canada formally reversed its position in 2010 under the previous federal government. And of course, it is the current government that has gone even further and made considerable commitments towards the full implementation of the Declaration. And now I'll hand it over to Paul.
Hi. In July 2008, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon emphasized the diverse significance of the UN Declaration, and he described the Declaration, as you can see on the slide, as a visionary step towards addressing Indigenous peoples' human rights. States can build or rebuild their relationships with Indigenous peoples and strengthen state-Indigenous relationships, promote reconciliation, and ensure that the past is not repeated. The UN Declaration is significant in a number of other ways. The Declaration can be used to interpret Indigenous rights and state obligations both internationally and at home, and this includes Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, which recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. It can also be used to fill in the gaps in treaties between Indigenous peoples and states. This is especially useful with respect to number treaties, which includes much less detail than modern treaties. The Declaration can be used to guide policy development, negotiations, and litigation involving Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous governments, and corporations. It can be used to transcend the box of domestic law, which is too often, too confining. And it can guide nation building and strengthen Indigenous communities. This is important, especially in the current process of rejecting colonialism in favor of a contemporary approach consistent with justice and human rights. Now, let's examine the role of international human rights law in Canada. In 2002, Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin of the Supreme Court of Canada highlighted that, and you can see it on the slide, Aboriginal rights from the beginning have been shaped by international concepts. Canada cannot ignore new international norms, and Aboriginal rights are an international matter. Now, in this 1987 decision, former Chief Justice Brian Dixon ruled that declarations and other international human rights instruments are relevant and persuasive sources for interpreting the Canadian Charter's provisions. So if international declarations are used to interpret human rights in the Canadian Charter, which is in Part 1 of the Constitution Act 1982, then the same rule must be true for Indigenous peoples' human rights in Part 2, namely Section 35. And one good example of declarations being used in the courts is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948 and has been cited hundreds of times in Canadian courts. Now, another rule of interpretation by the Supreme Court of Canada, which is relevant here, is that legislation will be presumed to conform to international law. Courts will strive to avoid interpretations of domestic law that would be in violation of Canada's international obligations, unless the wording of the statute clearly requires such a result. And the key international obligation of Canada, which has existed since 1976, is to promote and respect the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination. Now, in 2012, the Federal Court of Canada ruled that the UN Declaration and other international human rights instruments, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, may be used to interpret domestic human rights law. The UN Declaration provides an Indigenous context for interpreting Indigenous peoples' rights. So the UN Declaration has both application and legal effect in Canadian law. Over to you, Jennifer.
So we have we included this quote that comes from a recent decision in litigation that involved health care. And we wanted to include this because it's a good example of how in this judgment the UN Declaration was cited and was clearly used, the judge was using the UN Declaration in making the judgment on this case. And in this case also, one of the reasons we wanted to highlight it is, at this particular provision, is that the judgment is also using the declaration to affirm that an approach that combines both traditional medicine and Western medicine is in the best interest of the child. And that also, of course, the collaborative approach between the family and the medical practitioners is in the best interest of the child. But it's a really good example of illustrating how the declaration can be used and is being used legally in advancing Indigenous people's rights. And then we go to the fact that, one of the things that the previous federal government had really tried hard to do was to promote the idea that the declaration was merely aspirational. And it's simply inaccurate. It's an inaccurate portrayal of how you use international human rights law. And of course, UN declarations have legal effect, and this one is no different. So, and this quote here comes from the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Professor James Anaya, and where he is asserting the significance of the Declaration, which has, implementation should be regarded as political, moral, and yes, legal imperative without qualification. So I think that that's important to keep that in mind, and that the Declaration does have diverse legal effects. So UN declarations are not the same as UN treaties or UN conventions. There is a difference in them. And UN conventions, when a state ratifies a convention, then the state is legally bound to it. So declarations are different. Declarations don't get ratified by states, but when they're adopted by the General Assembly, they are then applicable to all states. So while it isn't binding in the same manner as a treaty, it does have diverse legal effects. And these include the fact that governments and others would be, say public health bodies, can use the declaration in policy development and decision making. So, and Canadian courts obviously are using the declaration in interpreting human rights, and also international treaty bodies are using the declaration in interpreting international obligations. So when Canada has to report at the international level on commitments that it has made under legally binding conventions. And when it makes those reports, the UN Declaration is also one of the standards that will be used by those bodies to evaluate Canada's compliance to its international commitments. So now we want to just go to the parts of the Declaration. We've highlighted some parts of the Declaration in relationship to health. And we want to look at a few different provisions. We've selected a few that we will highlight, but it's important also to emphasize that declarations are meant to be read as a whole and used as a whole, and the interconnectedness between different provisions is very important. So one of the things that we're starting with here, on the bottom half of the slide, you'll see the text of Article 3 of the UN Declaration, which is on the right of self-determination. And this is a really critical article in the UN Declaration, and Indigenous representatives fought very hard to have this included in the text. And you can see in the top half of the slide from the Canadian Medical Association, as early as 1994, the CMA was acknowledging and recognizing that self-determination and working towards self-determination and recognizing self-determination improves the health of both individuals and communities for Indigenous peoples. And then now I'll go to Article 7 in the UN Declaration, and Article 7 is known as the right to security. And security can encompass many factors, obviously. And in this case, if you see in the first paragraph, both physical and mental integrity. So obviously there's clear interconnectedness with the right of security to the relationship with health. And in the second part of the article, we see that when we're talking about several aspects here of security, health aspects can be both individual and collective, and we'll speak more about that as we carry on. But the collective right to health obviously includes addressing the child welfare situation, and this is something that has been quite prominent in Canada in recent years, with a case before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal settling in that, in fact, the Canadian state is discriminating against Indigenous children, and this is something that must be addressed. So other issues around security also can be the cause for unhealthy communities, and all of those elements have to be addressed when we're talking about health. And now back to Paul.
Okay, so Article 21 is an important article for the well-being of Indigenous peoples and individuals. And you can see on the slide in paragraph 1 that Indigenous peoples have the right without discrimination to the improvement of their economic and social conditions. And this includes such key aspects as education, housing, sanitation, health, and social security. Now, in paragraph 2, it indicates that states shall take effective measures and special measures to ensure continuing improvement of Indigenous peoples' economic and social conditions. And at the same time, it indicates that particular attention is required for the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities. All of these persons now have international human rights instruments addressing them specifically. So later, as you become more familiar with the UN Declaration and international law, one should use for greater effect both the UN Declaration and existing international law. For example, you have the convention, the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. So that could be used with the UN Declaration. Now, Article 20, Paragraph 1, affirms Indigenous peoples' right, and you can see it in bold, right to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence. And the term subsistence includes food. So when this right is read together with Indigenous peoples' right to security in Article 7.2, and that's the article Jennifer had just referred to and had on the screen, Indigenous peoples, reading the two together, would have a right to food security. And food security has important consequences, as you know, for Indigenous cultures and health. Now, when we look at Articles 20 and 23, you see that both refer to Indigenous peoples' right to development. Article 23 affirms Indigenous peoples' right to determine their own priorities for development, which include health, housing, and other essential aspects. So it is important to always consider Indigenous peoples' own right to development when addressing proposed third-party developments in or affecting Indigenous lands and territories. Now, earlier Jennifer referred to Article 24 when she described the Hamilton Health Sciences Corporation case. And Article 24, as indicated on the slide, Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. Now, in addition, Indigenous individuals also have the right to all social and health services. Now, too often, as you know, such services are not readily available in northern and other remote communities. Now, in its November 2016 report on Canada, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which sometimes is referred to as CEDAW, highlighted the multiple forms of discrimination and poverty suffered by Indigenous women. While noting Canada's commitment to fully implementing the UN Declaration, the committee expressed its concern about the lack of a coherent plan or strategy to improve the socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous communities, in particular Indigenous women. And in May 2000, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is another treaty body at the international level, concluded that in Indigenous communities, the health of the individual is often linked to the health of the society as a whole and has a collective dimension. In this respect, the committee explained that forced relocations of Indigenous people related to development activities and denying them their sources of nutrition have a destructive effect on health, and this notion of forced relocations is addressed in the UN Declaration in Article 10. That's to Jennifer.
So now we just wanted to give a few examples of possible ways for implementing the UN Declaration and with regards to health at the community level. And some of these you may already be engaged in your work. Some of them may seem quite straightforward. So, but we just wanted to highlight a few what we saw as a few important elements. And the first one, in terms of culturally appropriate approaches to public health. And I mean, I think that this is generally well understood, but I think that I have an example to share to illustrate how important this can be. So this was an example that was shared at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues many years ago when one of their experts had done some research into health. And one of the studies that she had come across, which was from Latin America, I think perhaps Peru, but I'm not 100% confident of that, but where a new hospital had been built, and one of the things that the health professionals were quite concerned about was that women were not coming in for childbirth services. And even in high-risk pregnancies, women did not want to come in for this. And there was a concern that the health was being compromised because of not wanting to use the health services. So finally someone did some investigating to figure out what was at the root of the problem. And so there was two things they discovered. One, the color they had painted the maternity ward was a color in that culture that represented death. So women were not going to come to deliver birth in that particular environment. And the other was, culturally, in their culture, the women had a ceremony of burying the afterbirth that was quite important and quite significant to them culturally in the process of the health of the child. And the hospital was not letting women keep the afterbirth. So women were choosing, even in risky situations, to not seek medical services because those medical services were not culturally appropriate. And I think that that's a really easy illustration of how, some simple engagement with cultures and with communities can dramatically improve the relationship between communities and healthcare providers. Of course, the option of having healthcare provided in Indigenous languages, or if not in the applicable language, at least for there to be the possibility of interpreters so that people are being able to be engaged in their healthcare in a way where they can understand what's happening. And of course, the question of health services being delivered in the community as opposed to people being shipped out of the community. And what's the impact in remote communities when people must leave the community to seek health care? And finally, of course, capacity building in communities to deliver their own health care. And there's some great examples around the whole country on where we can see that when communities are empowered in health care, whether it's in training for community members to be healthcare providers themselves, or also in the development of what healthcare services are going to look like in the community, what a difference it can make overall to the health system in the community. And a few others in terms of the holistic approach to public health in an Indigenous context. And that relates back to what I was just talking about with the cultural context, and it also relates obviously to the large impact of various social determinants on health care. In northern communities, this can often includes issues around nutrition, poverty, overcrowding in housing, mold in housing, and that all of those, the interconnectedness of all of those pieces and how they can affect health, both in an individual sense, but also in a collective sense, and that holistic approach is really necessary when looking at any of the individual factors. And in all of this, we have the critical importance of relationship building. And I think it's important to recognize that the legacy of the damage done by colonialization and the damage done over the history of several hundred years now cannot be minimized. And so the ability to build trust is really critically important. And damage has been done in so many ways by different non-Indigenous actors who have been inside Indigenous communities, whether it be government actors or others. And so I think that, the need to build community and to build trust and relationship building can't be underestimated. And of course, and this goes back to standards identified in the UN Declaration, any policies have to be developed in partnership with Indigenous peoples. And one that we didn't single out from the articles in the Declaration itself, but is that critically important, is that free, prior, and informed consent has to be respected both in the development and delivery of programs. And free, prior, and informed consent is one of the critical elements of the UN Declaration, and I think it's often focused in resource development, but obviously it's very critical in any policy development that affects Indigenous peoples.
It's important to underline here that poverty in international law is not just a word and it is not just a condition. As UNICEF emphasized in March 2000, poverty is a denial of human rights and human dignity. And you see at the bottom of the screen from the report of the Special Rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the Special Rapporteur indicates that for Indigenous peoples who rely directly on the products of forests, rivers, lakes, and oceans for their food, fuel, and medicine, environmental harm can and often does have disastrous consequences. Now, in UNICEF's 2016 report on the state of the world's children, it is stressed that no one is more vulnerable to poverty than children. Poverty robs millions of children of their potential and causes irreparable damage that reverberates through a lifetime. Generally, proposed developments that undermine Indigenous peoples' human rights and fail to safeguard the environment are likely to impoverish Indigenous peoples in diverse ways. Those most vulnerable, such as Indigenous women and children, may suffer the worst consequences. Now here we examine human rights, poverty, and sustainable development and look at how they are interrelated. On this slide, we have excerpts from the General Assembly's resolution, which is called, as you see at the bottom of the slide, Transforming Our World, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this resolution was adopted by the General Assembly by consensus in 2015. So that means no state in the world objected to this framework. And it indicates at the top of the slide that sustainable development is not solely an environmental issue. Sustainable development must certainly not impoverish Indigenous peoples, since you see that the goal is to end poverty by 2030. Sustainable development must also protect human rights, and this is a new feature, the direct link of protection of human rights to sustainable development. And it goes on to mention it must promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. Now at the bottom of the slide, it says that states pledge that no one will be left behind, and states will endeavor to reach the furthest behind first. And the UN General Assembly has indicated that this explicitly, in their view, and when I say in their view, the General Assembly includes all states, and it was a consensus resolution. It indicated that this includes Indigenous peoples. Jennifer.
So we wanted to include this photograph from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is our three commissioners. We include the photograph to pay some respects to their work. On the far side of the photo, we have Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild. In the middle, we have now Senator Murray Sinclair, the Chief Commissioner, and Dr. Marie Wilson. And you know, their work that they did was really quite tremendous. I can't use words to describe the incredible work that they did in their term as the commissioners for our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the impact, the ongoing impact that their work has had. And I just think it's really important to remember and to acknowledge that work. The TRC did raise up the work, as was mentioned in the introduction to this webinar, raised up the work of the UN Declaration in their calls to action and also in their final report. And we see here call to action 43 and call to action 44, where you can see, you know, they called on the UN Declaration to be the framework for reconciliation. And in call to action 44, they're calling on the government to have a national action plan for concrete strategies. So, you know, they were very clear of the importance of using the UN Declaration when we are trying to work towards reconciliation. And then in the next slide, I have call to action 22. There is a section in their calls to action, which is one of the meeting materials that you can access for this. In their calls to action, they have a subsection on health, calls to action 18 to 24. I've highlighted 22 here because this one specifically speaks to work that you are engaged in. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight that was because I think it's important to always remember the calls to action are not just to government. When you go through the calls to action, there's something there that I think everyone can engage with. You know, no matter what area you work in, or, you know, faith groups that you may be involved in, or civil society groups that you may be involved in, the calls to action have things that we can all participate in. And so specifically here, they're calling on people within the healthcare system. But also, in their calls to actions that deal with health care, in call to action 19, they also include on the establishment of measurable goals to identify and close the gap in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. And I think this is really important, and it speaks also to what Paul's already was talking about in terms of addressing the issues around poverty and sustainable development. So it's really important, I think, that the TRC has, you know, really identified the need for that holistic work, for sure, and also how we can use the declaration in a framework for reconciliation. And to follow up on that, in terms of reconciliation, we have a quote here that comes from our federal minister, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Jody Wilson-Raybould. And this is from a presentation she made last fall. And you see that she has called on reconciliation is about putting colonialism in the past. And I think that this is very important. You know, we think sometimes that colonialism, we're talking about historical situations, but that's just not accurate. And part of the reconciliation work, of course, has to be about addressing colonialism. And I was just recently, there was an article in the Globe and Mail in the health column that done by Andre Picard, and where he said, colonialism is about extinguishing rights, stripping people of land, language, and culture, in short, by keeping them sick, individually and collectively. So I think that's very important. And I think, again, it's important in the statement by the Attorney General that we have to close the socio-cultural gap. And obviously that's tied to health. And this is about nation building. So I think that you can see how all of these pieces are interwoven with around addressing colonialism and addressing the social determinants that have such a large impact on health. And then I do see the question that Angela has raised at the bottom of the screen, so maybe I'll answer that super quickly before Paul goes into the final section of the presentation. So I'll try and make it a very short answer. I think what happened is in the development of the Declaration, Canada had played, over the period of 2 decades, Canada played various roles, sometimes more progressive and sometimes less. Towards the end of the development of the Declaration, Canada actually took a really affirmative role, particularly under the administration of Paul Martin. And so then what happened is, as the work on the Declaration was coming to its conclusion, we had a federal election, and the government in Canada really, literally, weeks before the final text was submitted to the Human Rights Council, the Harper government came into power and was not interested particularly in the UN, and was certainly not interested in an international instrument that focused on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So Canada decided to vote against it, and that was both at the Human Rights Council and again at the General Assembly. And the reasons for that decision, in my opinion, were solely political and ideological. And I think that, in fact, bureaucrats who had worked on that file and various departments that were, when Canada's making decisions on the positions they will take on international instruments, the various departments that weigh in, the material provided to the politicians was that Canada should support the Declaration. So the decision made was solely a political decision. And the decision, frankly, to reverse and to endorse in 2010 came because of the 4 states that voted against. 2 had already reversed their positions, so the only 2 that were left opposing were Canada and the United States. Barack Obama had been elected, and it was widely known that he was planning on reversing the United States' position, which would have left Canada as the sole state in the world that was opposing this human rights declaration. So Canada decided that they would endorse, and when they endorsed, they did it by quietly releasing a press release on a Friday afternoon to a website, sort of buried on a website. So in fact, which is the best way to bury a news story, but it was so that they could say that they weren't the last to endorse. So that's sort of the very short version of Canada's flip-flop on the UN Declaration. And now Paul will take us into the remaining section.
Okay, so very briefly, in his mandate letter to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, the Prime Minister emphasized that the UN Declaration is a top priority. And in this regard, the PM specified that the Minister must work with provinces and territories and with Indigenous peoples to implement recommendations of the TRC, starting with implementation of the UN Declaration. And in October 2016, Prime Minister Trudeau declared publicly, "We're absolutely committed to the UN Declaration as we are to the calls to action of the TRC. These are strong words and commitments. However, full and effective implementation of the UN Declaration and the TRC calls to action are long overdue." Now you see at the bottom of this slide, in November 2015, this paragraph was included in the mandate letter for every federal minister. And the key part says that it is time for a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. To date, there is increasing concern and uncertainty as to whether the Prime Minister and his ministers are upholding such commitments, especially in the context of natural resource development. And in May, this is I believe the last slide, in May 2016, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Carolyn Bennett, declared at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York that Canada is now a full supporter of the Declaration without qualification. In addition, as shown at the bottom of the screen, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General has indicated that where current realities do not align with the standards of the UN Declaration, they must be systematically and coherently dismantled. All of these federal government commitments are highly constructive. However, to date, Indigenous peoples have not been involved in concrete and collaborative implementation of the UN Declaration. So this concludes the formal part of our presentation, and we welcome any and all questions. Thanks.
Wow, thank you very much, both of you, Jennifer and Paul, for this very outstanding presentation. I was spellbound as you went through this, and I'm sure others were as well. So I noted in your introductions that both of you are connected with the Assembly of First Nations in this respect, as it involves the UN Declaration. Are you able to share any knowledge of whether there are preparations being made to engage, or what you know? I mean, is there any action that you are aware of that is even being planned at this stage, where the Trudeau government is almost at, well, it's not at 2 years into its mandate, but it's getting towards 2 years. So is there anything you can share?
Do you want me to do it, or do you want to go ahead, Jennifer?
You go ahead, Paul.
Okay. Well, in February, the Prime Minister announced publicly that there will be a working group made up of 6 ministers, and Jody Wilson-Raybould, as Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, will chair this working group, and it involves some of the key ministers in various areas. There's 6 of them. I don't know them all by heart, but they include the Natural Resources Minister, Minister of Health, Minister relating to children, and 2 others. I don't know if, Jennifer, you remember. But they're all key areas for Indigenous peoples, and it's supposed to be a collaborative committee, and it's supposed to not only look to ensuring that Section 35 in terms of Aboriginal and treaty rights are respected, but it's to include international human rights standards, including the UN Declaration. And of course, these are critical in interpreting Section 35 in the Canadian Constitution. And the last element is that it has to support the TRC calls to action. So this is a potentially very useful body, because it's going to go through all of Canada's laws, policies, and operational practices that relate to Indigenous peoples. So we'll see what happens. But since February, we haven't seen anything concrete in actually engaging. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you, Paul.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you know what? I had myself on mute. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
I was just wondering, it's 3 months then since this announcement was made, Paul and Jennifer. Is that typical timing for, is that the pace of movement that you're used to with federal governments, or is this slow?
Well, I think that the problem, of course, as you pointed out, that, you know, how far we are from, we've already come a considerable distance from when this current federal government was elected. And the problem is, I think that generally things do move slowly, and I think that's mainly because, and particularly for the Attorney General, obviously is someone who has an incredibly full portfolio and has so many various things that she does take leadership on. So I think that the problem, of course, is, and we all feel it, is the question of time. And that, you know, work there does need, and I'm glad that you mentioned at the introduction the pilgrimage that happened between Kitchener and Ottawa. And I think that the message that those organizations that organized that, and they were trying to engage people on, was that, you know, we can't move so slowly that the work doesn't happen. You know, there is private members' legislation on implementing the Declaration, and we feel, the coalition that we work with supports, and the Assembly of First Nation also supports, that having a legislative approach would mean that a future government couldn't roll back advances that have been made. And we think this is critical. You know, too often we see that, I mean, as what happened at the time of the vote on the Declaration in 2006 was that you had a new government and they flip-flopped on their position. And so, you know, we don't want this work to be so politically driven, and it needs to be nonpartisan work, and it needs to have an action plan, and it needs to have legislation protection. And we feel that these are really important elements. And Paul and I were just in New York at the UN at the annual sessions of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and there Minister Bennett, Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, you know, she reconfirmed Canada's commitment to the implementation of the Declaration. And so, but we need, at this point, the political commitments are very solid, and now we really need to see the substance to go with those commitments.
Mm-hmm.
And I could just add that we've taken a view of really pushing in a friendly but firm way that some of this work gets implemented, because from what we've seen to date, the Conservatives, if they were to be elected, show little or no interest in the UN Declaration. Mm-hmm. So this could be another long period if the Liberals were to be defeated.
Right. So even more important that we try and get more concrete action accomplished within these 4 years before the next election.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And the big thing here is that the more different groups, associations like the Ontario Provincial Health Organization and the people you associate with, the more that people breathe life into the Declaration, it really makes it difficult for any future government to reverse everything, because it'll just be implemented or being implemented at so many different levels.
Mm-hmm. So you've given definitely planted some seeds that we can, as provincial associations, both OPHA and OPHA, advocate to Minister of Justice and Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould that timely action be taken, so that we can definitely follow up after this webinar with the Health Equity Group can follow up and see whether or not there might be interest from our provincial associations to do some advocacy. We're at our time. Unfortunately, time has flown. It's been a most engaging hour. I want to thank our speakers today for taking the time to teach us about the UN Declaration so that we can understand it better and hopefully use it as a tool. We've heard how it is a comprehensive international instrument and that it addresses both collective and individual inherent rights of Indigenous people. So I'm hoping that this will help us be better allies. I also want to thank you both for the work that you've done and that you continue to do, and I have tremendous admiration for that. And I would just like to close the webinar today with the hope that all of us can take away this knowledge that we have gained today to help us build more compassion, more connection, and stronger communities wherever we are. And so thank you very much, and thank you for all of you who have joined us. And please go avail yourselves of the materials and the links, and certainly of the recording of this webinar if you would like to listen again. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.